Eleanor watched the entire auction house laugh when she bid $20 on a pregnant mare, so starving that her ribs jutted through her dull, matted coat. What the veterinarian discovered inside that worthless horse 2 days later made him insist she sit down before he said another word. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The auction house in rural Kentucky was nothing more than an old wooden barn, with rows of metal bleachers that creaked under the weight of bidders who came seeking bargains and hidden treasures among the livestock. The air hung thick with dust and the smell of hay, and voices echoed off the walls as the auctioneer rattled off numbers in a rapid cadence that had become the heartbeat of these monthly gatherings. It was here, among seasoned horse traders and weekend farmers looking for their next project, that destinies were decided in mere seconds. A raised hand, a nodded head, and an animal's entire future would change course. On this particular Saturday morning in late autumn, the crowd was restless. The better horses had already been sold, and what remained were the animals that nobody wanted. The ones with obvious flaws, uncertain histories, or conditions that made them more trouble than they were worth. The auctioneer wiped sweat from his brow and glanced at his clipboard, preparing himself for what he knew would be a difficult sale. Into the ring walked a mare that made several people in the crowd shake their heads before a single word was spoken. She was a chestnut with a coat that had lost its shine long ago, her ribs visible beneath skin that seemed stretched too thin over her frame. Her mane was tangled and matted, and her eyes, though large and dark, carried a weariness that spoke of neglect and suffering. But what drew the most attention was her swollen belly, heavy with foal, hanging low between her hind legs, in a way that suggested the birth could come at any moment. The mare walked with difficulty, her steps slow and uncertain, and she kept her head down as if she had already accepted whatever fate awaited her. The murmurs began immediately, folks pointed and whispered, and the general consensus spread through the crowd like wildfire. A pregnant mare in this condition was nothing but a liability. The costs of veterinary care, the risk of complications during birth, the unknown lineage of the foal she carried, all of these factors added up to one simple conclusion in the minds of most present. She was worthless. The auctioneer cleared his throat and began his pitch, though even his voice lacked the enthusiasm he usually brought to his work. He mentioned that the mare was approximately 8 years old, that her breeding history was unknown, and that she was being sold as is with no guarantees. He did not mention where she had come from, and nobody asked. In the world of livestock auctions, some questions were better left unspoken. The silence that followed his introduction was deafening. Not a single hand went up. Not a single voice called out a bid. The auctioneer tried again, lowering the starting price, but still the crowd remained unmoved. It was then that a voice from the back of the bleachers cut through the quiet, harsh, and mocking. "That mare is not even worth $20, the man said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Look at her. She will probably die giving birth. And even if she does not, what kind of foal could possibly come from a creature like that?" Laughter rippled through the crowd, and the mare, as if sensing the cruelty in the air, lifted her head for just a moment before lowering it again in resignation. Sitting in the third row, away from the louder traders and the dismissive laughter, was a woman named Eleanor Mitchell. She was 62 years old, with silver hair pulled back in a practical braid, and hands that bore the calluses of decades spent working with horses. Eleanor had come to the auction that day not to buy, but simply to observe, to feel the familiar rhythm of the bidding, and perhaps to remember the days when her own farm had been filled with the sounds of hooves and whinnies. Those days were mostly behind her now. After her husband, James, had passed away 3 years ago, Eleanor had scaled back her operation considerably. She kept only a handful of horses on her small property in the hills, just enough to give her a reason to get up each morning and a connection to the life she and James had built together. But as she watched the pregnant mare standing alone in the ring, something stirred within her that she had not felt in a very long time. Eleanor studied the mare carefully, looking past the visible signs of neglect to something deeper. She noticed the way the horse held herself despite her exhaustion, the quiet dignity that remained even in the face of ridicule. She saw intelligence in those dark eyes, a spark that had not been completely extinguished by whatever hardships the mare had endured. And she saw something else too, something that made her heart ache with recognition. She saw a creature that had been written off by the world, dismissed as worthless, abandoned to whatever fate might befall her. Eleanor knew that feeling all too well. In the months after James died, she had felt the same way. Invisible and discarded, as if her own value had been buried alongside the man she loved. It had taken her a long time to find her footing again, to remember that life still held meaning, even in the absence of the one who had given her life its greatest joy. Now, looking at this forgotten mare, Eleanor felt a pull she could not ignore. Before she fully understood what she was doing, Eleanor raised her hand. The auctioneer, startled by the sudden movement, pointed in her direction and called out her bid. $20, she said, her voice steady and clear. The crowd turned to look at her, and she could see the surprise on their faces, the judgment in their eyes. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others smirked, already writing her off as a foolish old woman who did not know any better. But Eleanor did not waver. She held the auctioneer's gaze and waited. No one else bid. Why would they? In their minds, Eleanor had just agreed to take on a burden that would cost her far more in time, money, and heartbreak than any reasonable person would accept. The auctioneer called for any other bids, and when none came, he brought down his gavel with a sharp crack that echoed through the barn. Sold, he announced, to the lady in the third row for $20. Eleanor made her way down from the bleachers, ignoring the whispers that followed her like shadows. She could hear fragments of their conversations, words like crazy and waste, and she will regret this by morning. None of it mattered to her. She had learned long ago that the opinions of strangers carried no weight when measured against the convictions of her own heart. At the payment window, she handed over a crisp $20 bill and received a simple receipt in return. The transaction was complete, and the mare now belonged to her. As she walked toward the holding pens where the sold animals waited, Eleanor felt a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. She had acted on instinct, but now the reality of her decision was beginning to settle in. She was about to take responsibility for a pregnant mare in poor condition, with no knowledge of her history or the circumstances that had led her to this moment. It was perhaps the most impractical thing she had done in years, and yet it felt undeniably right. The mare stood in the corner of the pen, separated from the few other horses that milled about nervously. When Eleanor approached the fence, the horse lifted her head and regarded her with those large, weary eyes. There was no fear in her gaze, only a kind of cautious curiosity, as if she was trying to determine whether this new human would be different from the ones who had failed her before. Eleanor spoke softly, keeping her voice low and steady, the way she had learned to do after a lifetime of working with horses. "Easy now, girl. I know you have been through a lot, but things are going to be different from here on out. I promise you that." The mare's ears flickered forward at the sound of her voice, and for just a moment, something shifted in her expression. It was not quite trust, not yet, but it was the first tentative step toward it. Eleanor smiled and reached through the fence to touch the mare's nose, feeling the warmth of her breath against her palm. Loading the mare into the trailer was a slow and careful process. Eleanor did not rush her, understanding that patience would be the foundation of whatever relationship they would build together. She guided her with gentle words and even gentler hands, giving her time to investigate the unfamiliar space before asking her to step inside. When the mare finally walked up the ramp and settled into the trailer, Eleanor felt a small surge of triumph. It was a beginning, nothing more, but beginnings were everything. The drive back to her farm took nearly 2 hours, and Eleanor used the time to think about what lay ahead. She would need to call her veterinarian first thing in the morning to have the mare examined. She would need to prepare a clean, comfortable stall for her and stock up on the supplements and special feed that a pregnant horse in her condition would require. The list of tasks grew longer with each passing mile, but Eleanor did not feel overwhelmed. Instead, she felt something she had not experienced in a very long time. She felt purposeful. Her farm sat at the end of a winding gravel road, nestled in a valley surrounded by rolling hills that turned gold and amber in the autumn light. The property was modest by any standard, just 20 acres with an old farmhouse, a weathered red barn, and pastures that James had fenced himself more than 30 years ago. It was not much, but it was home, and as Eleanor pulled into the driveway with the trailer rattling behind her, she felt the familiar sense of peace that always washed over her when she returned to this place. The other horses, a pair of older geldings named Copper and Scout, lifted their heads from grazing and watched with interest as she backed the trailer up to the barn. They had not had a new companion in years, and their curiosity was evident in the way they moved closer to the fence. Ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring as they tried to catch the scent of the newcomer. Eleanor unloaded the mare slowly, giving her time to take in her new surroundings. The horse stood at the base of the ramp for a long moment, her head raised, her eyes scanning the pastures and the barn and the distant tree line. Eleanor wondered what she was thinking, whether she could sense that this place was different from wherever she had been before. After several minutes, the mare took a tentative step forward, then another, and soon she was standing on solid ground, her hooves pressing into the soft earth of Eleanor's farm. "Welcome home," Eleanor said quietly. "I do not know what your name was before, but I think I will call you Grace, because that is what you have, even after everything." Grace. The mare, now Grace, turned her head toward Eleanor at the sound of her new name, and something passed between them in that moment, an unspoken agreement, a silent pact. They would face whatever came next together. The first few days were focused entirely on stabilization and assessment. Eleanor's veterinarian, a kind man named Dr. Samuel Harris, who had been caring for her horses for over 2 decades, came out to examine Grace the morning after she arrived. His initial findings confirmed what Eleanor had already suspected. Grace was severely undernourished, her body depleted from the demands of pregnancy without adequate nutrition to support it. She had minor infections in her hooves that would need treatment, and her teeth showed signs of neglect that had likely made eating difficult for some time. But despite all of this, Dr. Harris found something else, something that made him pause during his examination with a look of surprise on his weathered face. He pressed his stethoscope to Grace's swollen belly and listened intently, moving it from one position to another, his brow furrowing in concentration. Eleanor watched him anxiously, her heart beating faster with each passing second. "Well, I will be," Dr. Harris said finally, straightening up and removing the stethoscope from his ears. "Eleanor, I need to tell you something, and I want you to sit down for this because it is going to complicate matters considerably." Eleanor felt her stomach tighten with worry, already imagining the worst possible scenarios. "Is something wrong with the foal?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Harris shook his head slowly, but his expression remained serious. "Not wrong exactly," he said, "but definitely unexpected. Eleanor, this mare is not carrying one foal. She is carrying two, twins. In all my years of practice, I have only seen this a handful of times. Twin pregnancies in horses are extremely rare, and they come with significant risks. The mortality rate for both the mare and the foals is considerably higher than with single births. We need to monitor her very carefully from here on out." Eleanor stared at him, struggling to process what he had just told her. Twins. The mare that nobody wanted. The horse that was not even worth $20, according to the cruel voice at the auction, was carrying not one miracle, but two. The news of the twin pregnancy changed everything. What had begun as a simple act of compassion, rescuing a neglected mare from an uncertain fate, had suddenly become something far more complex and demanding. Eleanor spent that evening sitting on an overturned bucket in the barn, watching Grace eat the special feed Dr. Harris had recommended, her mind racing with thoughts of all that could go wrong. Twin pregnancies in horses were notoriously dangerous. The equine uterus was designed to nurture a single foal, and when two embryos developed simultaneously, they often competed for resources in ways that left both compromised. Many twin pregnancies ended in spontaneous abortion. Others resulted in the birth of foals so weak and underdeveloped that they could not survive outside the womb. And even when the foals managed to be born alive, the strain on the mare could be catastrophic. Eleanor understood all of this, and yet she could not bring herself to feel despair. Instead, she felt a fierce determination rising within her, a resolve to give Grace and her unborn foals every possible chance at survival. The weeks that followed became a carefully orchestrated routine of care and vigilance. Eleanor woke before dawn each morning to check on Grace, monitoring her appetite, her energy levels, and the subtle changes in her body that signaled the progression of her pregnancy. She kept detailed notes in a worn leather journal, recording everything from the amount of feed Grace consumed to the frequency of the foal's movements, which she could sometimes feel when she pressed her hand gently against the mare's swollen belly. Dr. Harris visited every 2 weeks to perform ultrasounds and assess the health of both Grace and the twins, and each visit brought a mixture of relief and renewed anxiety. The foals were developing, he reported, but they were smaller than he would have liked, and the competition for nutrients in the womb was evident. He adjusted Grace's diet accordingly, adding supplements and increasing her caloric intake, but he warned Eleanor that even with the best care, the outcome remained uncertain. Grace, for her part, seemed to sense the importance of Eleanor's efforts. The wariness that had marked their first meeting gradually faded, replaced by a trust that deepened with each passing day. She began to nicker softly when she heard Eleanor's footsteps approaching the barn, a sound of recognition and welcome that never failed to warm Eleanor's heart. During the quiet afternoons, when the autumn sun slanted through the barn windows and painted golden rectangles on the straw-covered floor, Eleanor would sit beside Grace and talk to her, sharing stories about her life, about James, about the dreams they had once held for this farm. She told Grace about the horses they had raised together, the foals they had watched take their first wobbly steps, the joy and heartbreak that came with a life devoted to these magnificent creatures. And Grace would listen, her ears turned toward Eleanor's voice, her dark eyes reflecting an understanding that seemed almost human in its depth. As the weeks turned into months, the bond between woman and horse grew stronger than Eleanor could have imagined. She found herself thinking of Grace not as a rescue project or a responsibility, but as a true companion, a kindred spirit who had come into her life at precisely the moment she needed her most. The loneliness that had plagued Eleanor since James's death began to recede, pushed back by the daily rhythms of caring for Grace and the anticipation of the new lives growing within her. Eleanor's neighbors, who had initially regarded her auction purchase with skepticism and concern, began to take notice of the transformation taking place. They saw the light returning to Eleanor's eyes, the purpose in her step, and even the most cynical among them had to admit that perhaps she had known what she was doing after all. Some even stopped by to offer help, bringing extra hay or spending an afternoon mending fences, drawn by the quiet miracle unfolding on her small farm. Winter arrived with a vengeance that year, blanketing the hills in snow and sending temperatures plummeting to levels that made Eleanor worry constantly about Grace's comfort. She installed heat lamps in the barn and lined Grace's stall with extra bedding, creating a warm cocoon that would protect her from the worst of the cold. The other horses, Copper and Scout, seemed to understand that Grace required special attention, and they kept their distance without any prompting, as if they too recognized the delicate nature of her condition. On the coldest nights, Eleanor would make multiple trips to the barn, checking on Grace by the light of a lantern, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. She would stand beside the mare, her hand resting on her neck, feeling the steady pulse of life beneath her palm, and she would whisper words of encouragement that she was not entirely sure Grace could understand, but that she needed to say nonetheless. By late January, Grace's belly had grown enormous, stretched tight with the weight of the 2 lives she carried. Dr. Harris estimated that she was within weeks of giving birth, and he began visiting more frequently, his expression growing more serious with each examination. The foals had continued to develop, but one was noticeably smaller than the other, and he expressed concern about whether it would have the strength to survive the birthing process. He spoke to Eleanor frankly about the possibilities, explaining that she should prepare herself for the chance that one or both foals might not make it, or that complications during delivery could put Grace herself at risk. Eleanor listened to his warnings with a heavy heart, but she refused to abandon hope. She had come too far with Grace to give up now, and she believed with every fiber of her being that this mare, who had been dismissed as worthless by so many, had the strength to prove them all wrong. The days of waiting were the hardest. Eleanor found herself unable to sleep for more than a few hours at a time, her mind constantly drifting to the barn, where Grace stood in the darkness, carrying her precious burden. She set up a baby monitor in the stall so she could hear any sounds of distress from the house, and she kept her boots by their door, ready to run out at a moment's notice. The anticipation was almost unbearable, a constant tension that hummed beneath every moment of every day. And yet, amid the worry and the uncertainty, there was also a strange kind of peace. Eleanor realized that regardless of what happened, she had already received a gift beyond measure. Grace had given her a reason to care deeply again, to invest her heart in something outside herself, to remember what it felt like to love without reservation. Whatever came next, she would face it with gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this point. The night it happened was the coldest of the year. A bitter wind swept down from the mountains, rattling the windows of Eleanor's farmhouse and sending swirls of snow dancing across the frozen ground. Eleanor had checked on Grace 3 times already, each visit confirming that the mare was restless but not yet in active labor. By midnight, exhaustion had finally overtaken her vigilance, and she had dozed off in the armchair by the fireplace, the baby monitor crackling softly on the table beside her. She dreamed of James, as she often did on nights like this, dreamed of walking with him through summer pastures while young horses ran alongside them, their manes streaming in the warm breeze. It was a beautiful dream, filled with the golden light of memory, and she did not want to wake from it. But a sound from the monitor pulled her back to consciousness. A low, urgent sound that made her heart leap into her throat before her eyes were fully open. She was on her feet and moving toward the door before she was fully awake, grabbing her coat from the hook and shoving her feet into boots without bothering to tie them. The cold hit her like a physical blow when she stepped outside, stealing her breath and making her eyes water. But she did not slow down. The barn was 50 yards from the house, and she covered the distance in what felt like seconds, her legs carrying her with a speed she had not known she still possessed. When she threw open the barn door and rushed inside, the warmth from the heat lamps wrapped around her like an embrace, but she barely noticed. All her attention was focused on Grace, who stood in the center of her stall, her sides heaving, her body drenched in sweat despite the cold. The mare turned her head toward Eleanor and let out a sound that was half whinny and half groan, a plea for help that needed no translation. Eleanor moved quickly but calmly, drawing on decades of experience to guide her actions. She had been present for many births over the years, had helped mares through difficult deliveries, and celebrated the arrival of healthy foals. But she had never attended a twin birth, and the stakes tonight were higher than they had ever been before. She grabbed her phone from her coat pocket and called Dr. Harris, praying that he would answer despite the late hour. He picked up on the third ring, his voice groggy, but immediately alert when Eleanor explained the situation. He told her he would be there as quickly as possible, but the roads were treacherous, and it would take him at least 45 minutes to arrive. Until then, she was on her own. Eleanor took a deep breath, steadied her nerves, and turned back to Grace. "Okay, girl," she said softly, her voice steady even though her hands were trembling. "We are going to do this together, just like everything else." The first foal began to emerge just as Eleanor finished preparing the stall with clean towels and the emergency supplies she had assembled weeks ago in anticipation of this moment. She could see the white membrane of the amniotic sac, and within it, the delicate shape of tiny hooves. Grace strained and pushed, her muscles contracting with an effort that seemed to consume her entire being. And Eleanor knelt beside her, murmuring words of encouragement, while keeping a careful watch on the foal's progress. The delivery was slow, much slower than a single birth would typically be, and Eleanor found herself silently urging the foal to hurry, to emerge into the world before complications could set in. Minutes passed that felt like hours, and then, with a final tremendous effort from Grace, the first foal slid free onto the straw-covered floor of the stall. It was small, smaller than Eleanor had expected, but it was moving, its tiny legs already beginning to kick as it struggled to free itself from the membrane that surrounded it. Eleanor worked quickly to clear the foal's nose and mouth, ensuring that it could breathe, and then she stepped back to give Grace room to do what nature intended. The mare, despite her exhaustion, turned immediately to her newborn, her maternal instincts overriding the pain and fatigue that must have been overwhelming. She began to lick the foal clean, her tongue moving in long, gentle strokes that stimulated the baby's circulation and helped dry its wet coat. The foal was a filly, Eleanor realized as she watched, a beautiful chestnut and white paint, with markings that seemed almost deliberately artistic in their arrangement. She was perfect, a tiny miracle lying on the straw while her mother tended to her with a devotion that brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. But there was no time to savor the moment. The second foal was still inside, and Grace's labor was far from over. The complications began almost immediately. Grace's contractions continued, but the second foal did not appear. Minutes ticked by, and Eleanor could see the mare growing more distressed, her breathing becoming labored, her eyes rolling with pain and confusion. Something was wrong, Eleanor positioned herself to examine Grace and felt her heart sink when she realized that the second foal was not positioned correctly. Instead of the front hooves appearing first, as they should, she could feel a nose but no legs. The foal was trying to come into the world with its head first and its legs bent back, a position that would make natural delivery impossible. Without intervention, both the foal and Grace could die. Eleanor had handled minor malpresentations before, but this was beyond anything she had experienced. She needed help, and she needed it now. But Dr. Harris was still at least 20 minutes away, and 20 minutes might as well have been 20 years given the urgency of the situation. She made a decision in that moment, the kind of decision that defines a person's character more clearly than any words ever could. She would not stand by and watch Grace and her foal die, not after everything they had been through together. She rolled up her sleeves, took a steadying breath, and did what needed to be done. Working carefully but quickly, she reached inside to reposition the foal, her movements guided by instinct and desperation in equal measure. Grace groaned and shifted, but she did not kick or struggle, as if she understood that Eleanor was trying to save her baby. The seconds stretched into an eternity as Eleanor worked, her arms aching, her heart pounding, until finally, miraculously, she felt the foal's legs move into the correct position. She withdrew her hands and stepped back just as Grace began to push again, and this time the second foal emerged the way it was supposed to, hooves first, followed by nose and head and shoulders, and finally, the rest of its tiny, fragile body. The second foal lay motionless on the straw, and for a terrible, heart-stopping moment, Eleanor thought it was dead. The first filly was already attempting to lift her head, her tiny body responding to the stimulation of her mother's tongue, but her sibling showed no such signs of life. Eleanor dropped to her knees beside the still form, her hands moving frantically to clear the membrane from its face, to wipe the fluid from its nostrils. The foal was another filly, smaller even than her sister, with a coat that was almost entirely white, except for patches of chestnut that splashed across her body like paint thrown by an artist's careless hand. She was beautiful, heartbreakingly beautiful, and she was not breathing. Eleanor refused to accept what her eyes were telling her. She rubbed the foal's sides vigorously, trying to stimulate a response, trying to coax life into the tiny body that lay limp beneath her hands. She had not come this far, had not fought this hard, to lose one of Grace's babies now. Not like this. Not when they were so close. The seconds that followed were the longest of Eleanor's life. She continued to work on the foal, her movements growing more desperate, her prayers becoming more fervent. Grace, sensing that something was wrong, stopped tending to her first baby and turned her attention to the second, her nose pushing gently against the still form, her breath warm against the foal's face. And then, just when Eleanor was about to give up hope, she saw it. A twitch. The tiniest flicker of movement in the foal's nostril, followed by a shuddering gasp that filled the barn with the most beautiful sound Eleanor had ever heard. The filly was breathing. She was alive. Eleanor sat back on her heels and let out a sob of relief that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her soul. Tears streamed down her face, cutting warm tracks through the cold that had numbed her cheeks, and she made no effort to wipe them away. Grace nickered softly and resumed her ministrations, her tongue moving over both foals now, cleaning them and warming them and welcoming them into the world with a mother's unconditional love. Dr. Harris arrived 15 minutes later, his truck sliding slightly on the icy driveway as he pulled up to the barn. He burst through the door expecting chaos and emergency, and instead found Eleanor sitting in the straw beside Grace, watching as two tiny foals nursed for the first time. The veterinarian stopped in his tracks, his medical bag hanging from his hand, his mouth falling open in undisguised astonishment. He had prepared himself for the worst, had brought equipment for emergency surgery and medications for every complication he could imagine. What he had not prepared for was this: a successful twin birth, both foals alive and nursing, the mare exhausted but stable. It was, by any measure, a miracle. Eleanor looked up at him and smiled, a weary smile that held within it all the emotions of the past few hours, the fear and the hope and the overwhelming joy of watching life triumph against impossible odds. "They made it," she said simply. "All three of them made it." "Doctor." Harris performed a thorough examination of Grace and the foals, his professional demeanor slowly giving way to genuine wonder as he confirmed what Eleanor already knew. The twins were small, yes, and the second filly was noticeably weaker than her sister, but they were healthy. Their hearts beat strongly, their lungs filled with air, and their instinct to nurse was fully intact. Grace, despite the tremendous strain of delivering two foals, showed no signs of serious injury or distress. Her vital signs were stable, and her maternal instincts were exactly as they should be. The veterinarian shook his head slowly as he packed up his equipment, still struggling to process what he was seeing. "In 30 years of practice," he told Eleanor, "I have never witnessed anything quite like this. Twin births almost never go this well. Most end in tragedy, one way or another. But these two little girls, and this mare, they defied every statistic and every expectation." He paused and looked at Eleanor with an expression of deep respect. "And so did you. What you did tonight, repositioning that foal without any assistance, that took courage and skill that most people simply do not possess." Eleanor shook her head, deflecting the praise. "I just did what needed to be done," she said. "Grace did all the hard work. I was just here to help." But even as she spoke, she knew that the night had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. She had faced a crisis alone, had made life and death decisions in moments of extreme pressure, and had emerged victorious. The confidence that had slowly eroded in the years since James's death was returning, filling the empty spaces within her with a renewed sense of purpose and capability. She was not just a lonely old woman keeping herself busy with a few horses. She was someone who could make a difference, who could fight for what mattered and win. Grace and her foals had given her that gift, and it was one she would carry with her for the rest of her days. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the hills, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold, Eleanor finally allowed herself to rest. She sat with her back against the wall of the stall, wrapped in a horse blanket that Dr. Harris had insisted she take, watching Grace and her babies in the warm glow of the heat lamps. The first filly, the larger and stronger of the two, had already managed to stand on her wobbly legs, a feat that typically took newborn foals about an hour to accomplish. She stood beside her mother, her tiny head barely reaching Grace's chest, her eyes wide with the wonder of a world she was only beginning to discover. The second filly, the one who had nearly died before taking her first breath, was still lying in the straw, but she was alert and responsive, her eyes tracking the movements of her mother and sister with keen interest. She would need more time and more care, Eleanor knew, but something told her that this little one was a fighter. She had already beaten death once, in the first minutes of her life. That kind of spirit did not give up easily. Eleanor closed her eyes and let the exhaustion wash over her. She could hear the soft sounds of the foals nursing, the gentle rhythm of Grace's breathing. the distant howl of the wind outside the barn. She had not felt this peaceful in years, this certain that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever obstacles remained to be overcome, she would face them with the same determination that had carried her through this night. Grace had taught her that. The mare who had been deemed worthless by the world had shown Eleanor what true value really meant. And the two tiny lives that Grace had brought into the world were proof that miracles happened, even in the darkest and coldest of nights, to those who refused to stop believing. The days that followed the birth were filled with a kind of joy that Eleanor had almost forgotten existed. She named the foals Hope and Faith, names that seemed to capture the essence of their miraculous arrival. Hope was the firstborn, the larger and stronger of the two, a filly whose chestnut and white markings gave her the appearance of a painted masterpiece brought to life. She was bold and curious from the very beginning, her personality emerging within hours of her birth, as she explored every corner of the stall with fearless determination. Faith, the smaller twin who had nearly died before drawing her first breath, was more cautious and gentle, preferring to stay close to her mother's side and observe the world from the safety of Grace's shadow. But what she lacked in boldness she made up for in resilience, gaining strength with each passing day, defying the predictions of those who believed she was too weak to survive. Eleanor spent nearly every waking moment in the barn during those first weeks, monitoring the foal's progress with an attention to detail that bordered on obsession. She weighed them daily, tracking their growth on a chart that hung on the barn wall. She watched them nurse, ensuring that Faith got her share despite Hope's more aggressive appetite. She documented their first steps, their first ventures outside the stall, their first tentative interactions with Copper and Scout, who observed the newcomers with a mixture of curiosity and paternal protectiveness. The older geldings seemed to understand that these tiny creatures were something special, and they kept a respectful distance while remaining close enough to offer their silent support. The small herd that Eleanor had assembled on her modest farm was becoming a family, united by bonds that transcended the simple categories of species and ownership. Word of the twin birth spread quickly through the community. In a region where horses were still a way of life for many families, the successful delivery of healthy twins was news that captured everyone's attention. Neighbors who had once shaken their heads at Eleanor's impulsive auction purchase now stopped by to see the miracle foals for themselves. They came bearing gifts, bags of feed and bundles of carrots, and hand-knitted blankets for the babies. Their initial skepticism transformed into admiration and respect. Eleanor welcomed them all, grateful for the support and the company after years of relative isolation. She found herself telling the story of Grace's rescue over and over, each retelling adding new details and new layers of meaning as she reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this point. The mare, who was not even worth $20, had become the talk of the county, a symbol of hope and redemption that resonated with everyone who heard her tale. As the weeks turned into months, Hope and Faith continued to thrive beyond all expectations. They grew strong and healthy, their coats developing the lustrous shine that marked well-cared-for horses. Hope lived up to her name in every way, her confident personality making her a natural leader who feared nothing and no one. She was the first to investigate any new object that appeared in the pasture, the first to approach strangers who visited the farm, the first to test the boundaries that Eleanor set for her. Faith, in contrast, developed a deep sensitivity and emotional intelligence that set her apart. She seemed to sense the moods of those around her, gravitating toward anyone who was sad or troubled, offering comfort with her quiet presence and gentle nuzzle. Eleanor often found her standing beside Grace, the two of them sharing moments of stillness that spoke of a bond between mother and daughter that words could never capture. Dr. Harris continued his regular visits, his initial professional concern evolving into a personal investment in the welfare of the little family. He marveled at the foal's development, noting that despite their challenging start, they showed no signs of the health problems that often plagued twins. Their bones were strong, their organs functioned normally, and their mental acuity was exactly what it should be for horses their age. He credited Eleanor's tireless care and attention, but Eleanor always redirected the praise to Grace, insisting that the mare's extraordinary mothering instincts were the true reason for her daughter's success. Grace had proven herself to be everything the auction crowd had failed to see, a horse of remarkable strength and character whose value could never be measured in dollars and cents. She had given everything she had to bring her foals into the world and to nurture them through their vulnerable first months. And Eleanor loved her for it, with a depth of feeling that sometimes took her breath away. Spring arrived slowly that year, the snow melting in patches that revealed the brown grass beneath, the trees budding with the first hints of green that promised warmer days ahead. Eleanor opened the pasture gates and watched as Hope and Faith experienced the wider world for the first time. They ran together through the fields, their young legs carrying them in circles of pure joy, their manes streaming behind them like banners of celebration. Grace followed at a more measured pace, her watchful eyes never straying far from her daughter's, her body language radiating a calm contentment that seemed to say she had finally found the peace she had been seeking all her life. Copper and Scout joined them in the pasture, the old geldings moving with a stiffness that betrayed their age, but showing no reluctance to be part of the herd's springtime revelry. Eleanor stood at the fence and watched them all, her heart so full she thought it might burst. It was during one of these quiet moments of observation that Eleanor noticed something about Faith that she had not seen before. The smaller twin had always been close to Grace, but now she was beginning to show an interest in Eleanor herself. She would break away from her mother and sister to approach the fence where Eleanor stood, her soft nose reaching through the rails to touch Eleanor's outstretched hand. There was something in her eyes, a recognition and a trust that went beyond the normal bond between human and horse. Eleanor felt it too, a connection that seemed to resonate at some frequency she could not explain but could not deny. Faith was special. They were all special. But Faith, the filly who had almost died before she was born, who had fought for every breath in those first terrifying moments, Faith was something more. She was a reminder that the most precious things in life often came wrapped in the most fragile packages, and that strength was not always measured by size or speed, but by the courage to keep going when everything seemed lost. The summer that followed was one of the happiest Eleanor could remember since James had passed away. The farm that had once felt empty and echoing with absence now pulsed with life and energy. Hope and Faith had grown into beautiful young horses, their bodies filling out with muscle and their personalities becoming more distinct with each passing day. Hope had developed into a striking mare, whose chestnut and white coat drew admiring glances from everyone who saw her. She moved with a confidence and grace that belied her young age, her every step suggesting a power and potential that even the most casual observer could recognize. Faith remained smaller than her sister, her frame more delicate and her temperament more gentle, but she possessed a beauty all her own, a quiet elegance that made people stop and stare in a different way. Together, the twins were a sight to behold, a living testament to the miracle of their birth and the love that had sustained them. Eleanor had begun working with both foals on basic training, teaching them to accept a halter, to lead, to stand for grooming and handling. Hope took to the lessons with enthusiasm, her bold personality making her eager to engage with whatever challenge Eleanor presented. She learned quickly and retained everything, her intelligence evident in the way she anticipated commands and responded to the subtlest cues. Faith required a gentler approach, her sensitivity demanding patience and understanding that Eleanor was more than willing to provide. She startled easily at sudden movements and loud noises, but once she trusted that she was safe, she gave herself over to the training with a willingness that touched Eleanor's heart. The bond between Eleanor and Faith deepened during these sessions, the two of them communicating in a language of touch and tone that seemed to transcend the barrier between species. It was during this period of growth and training that a visitor arrived at the farm, a visitor whose presence would set in motion a chain of events that none of them could have anticipated. His name was Marcus Webb, and he was one of the most respected horse trainers in the state. He had heard about the Miracle Twins through the network of horse enthusiasts that connected the region, and curiosity had brought him to Eleanor's door on a warm afternoon in late July. He was a tall man in his 50s, with weathered skin and keen eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they saw. Eleanor recognized him immediately from photographs that she had seen in equestrian magazines, and she felt a flutter of nervousness as she welcomed him to her property. A man like Marcus Webb did not make casual visits. His presence here meant something, though Eleanor could not yet guess what. Marcus spent nearly 2 hours at the farm that day, watching Hope and Faith move through the pasture, observing their interactions with Grace and the geldings, asking Eleanor detailed questions about their birth and development. He examined both foals with the practiced eye of someone who had spent a lifetime assessing horses, running his hands along their legs, checking their conformation, studying the way they carried themselves. When he finally spoke his conclusions, his words hit Eleanor like a thunderbolt. "These are extraordinary animals," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority that came from decades of experience. "The bold one, Hope, she has the makings of a competition horse. Her build, her movement, her spirit, they all point to exceptional athletic potential. But the other one, Faith, she is something rarer still. I have seen horses like her before, horses with that particular sensitivity and intelligence. They make exceptional therapy horses, the kind that can change people's lives." Eleanor listened to his assessment with a mixture of pride and apprehension. She had never considered what the future might hold for Hope and Faith beyond her small farm. The idea that they possessed potential for greatness, that they might have destinies that extended beyond the quiet life she had imagined for them, was both thrilling and terrifying. Marcus seemed to sense her conflict, and he softened his tone as he continued. "I am not here to take your horses from you, Mrs. Mitchell. That is not my intention at all. What I am proposing is an opportunity. There is a showcase event next month, an exhibition where breeders and trainers present their most promising young horses. It is an invitation-only affair, very prestigious. I would like to sponsor Hope and Faith for inclusion. It would give them exposure to people who could appreciate their true value, and it would tell the world the story of their remarkable beginning." Eleanor did not answer immediately. She looked out at the pasture, where Grace stood watching her daughters graze, the mare's eyes meeting hers across the distance, with an expression that seemed almost knowing. The journey that had begun at that dusty auction house, when she had raised her hand to bid $20 for a pregnant mare that nobody wanted, had led to this moment. She thought about all the people who had laughed at her decision, who had called Grace worthless, who had predicted nothing but trouble and heartbreak. She thought about the long nights of worry during Grace's pregnancy, the terror of the twin birth, the moment when Faith had lain motionless on the straw, and Eleanor had refused to let her die. All of it had brought them here, to an opportunity that could change everything. She turned back to Marcus and saw in his eyes a respect that she had not expected. He understood, perhaps better than most, what it had taken to get to this point. The decision did not come easily. Eleanor spent several days weighing the possibilities, discussing the opportunity with Dr. Harris and the neighbors who had become invested in the twins' story. There were risks involved in taking Hope and Faith to a public event, exposing them to stress and scrutiny at such a young age. But there were also potential benefits that Eleanor could not ignore. The showcase could open doors that would otherwise remain closed, could provide resources that would ensure the twins' well-being for years to come. And perhaps most importantly, it could prove to the world what Eleanor had known from the moment she first saw Grace standing alone in that auction ring. These horses were not worthless. They had never been worthless. They were priceless, and it was time for everyone to see it. Eleanor made her decision on a quiet evening, as she sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. She would accept Marcus Webb's offer and take Hope and Faith to the showcase. The opportunity was too significant to let fear stand in the way, and she owed it to the twins, to Grace, and to herself to see where this path might lead. She called Marcus the next morning to confirm her participation, and from that moment forward, her life became a whirlwind of preparation. There were documents to complete, health certificates to obtain, transportation to arrange. Dr. Harris conducted thorough examinations of both foals and declared them fit for travel, his professional approval accompanied by a personal note of encouragement that meant more to Eleanor than he could know. The countdown to the showcase had begun, and with each passing day, Eleanor felt the weight of anticipation growing heavier on her shoulders. The preparations extended beyond paperwork and logistics. Eleanor knew that Hope and Faith needed to be ready for the experience they were about to face: the crowds, the noise, the unfamiliar environment of a large equestrian facility. She began exposing them to new stimuli gradually, playing recordings of applause and announcements, introducing them to strangers who came to help with the training. Hope took everything in stride, her confident nature making her adaptable and unflappable. Faith required more careful handling, her sensitive temperament demanding a gentler approach to desensitization. Eleanor worked with her patiently, never pushing too hard, always respecting the boundaries that Faith communicated through her body language. By the time the showcase date arrived, both twins had made remarkable progress, though Eleanor knew that nothing could fully prepare them for what lay ahead. The morning of departure came with a chill in the air that hinted at autumn's approach. Eleanor loaded Hope and Faith into the trailer with the help of neighbors who had gathered to see them off, their faces reflecting a mixture of excitement and nervous anticipation. Grace watched from the pasture fence as her daughters were led away, her eyes following their every movement, until the trailer doors closed and blocked her view. Eleanor paused before climbing into the truck, looking back at the mare, who had started it all. "I will bring them back to you," she promised silently, her heart aching at the separation. Grace nickered softly, as if she understood, and Eleanor held that sound close as she began the 4-hour drive to the showcase venue. The facility where the event was held was unlike anything Eleanor had experienced in her years of working with horses. It was a sprawling complex of arenas and stables, immaculately maintained and buzzing with activity. Horses of every breed and color were being unloaded from trailers that bore the logos of prestigious farms and training operations. The people who moved among them wore expensive clothing and carried themselves with the confidence of those accustomed to success. Eleanor felt suddenly out of place in her worn jeans and faded work shirt, her modest trailer looking shabby next to the gleaming professional rigs that surrounded it. For a moment, she questioned whether she had made a mistake in coming. whether she and her miracle twins truly belonged in such elevated company. Marcus Webb found her before her doubts could take root. He greeted her warmly and introduced her to his team, a group of assistants who would help with the logistics of presenting Hope and Faith. He led her to the stalls that had been reserved for the twins, spacious accommodations with fresh bedding and water already in place. As Eleanor settled the foals into their temporary home, Marcus filled her in on the schedule. The presentation would take place the following afternoon in the main arena. Each horse or group of horses would be brought before the audience while their handler shared their story. Judges would evaluate the animals on conformation, movement, and potential, but the real value of the showcase lay in the connections made and the impressions formed. People came to these events looking for exceptional horses, and Marcus was confident that Hope and Faith would capture their attention. That night, Eleanor stayed in a small hotel room near the facility, but sleep proved elusive. She lay in the unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts of what tomorrow might bring. She thought about Grace, alone in the pasture back home, waiting for her daughters to return. She thought about James, and how proud he would have been to see how far she had come since his death. She thought about the auction, the cruel voice that had declared Grace worthless, and the laughter that had rippled through the crowd at the very idea of bidding on such a pathetic creature. Tomorrow, she would stand before a different kind of crowd and tell the story of how that worthless mare had produced two of the most extraordinary foals anyone had ever seen. Tomorrow, she would prove that value was not determined by appearances or circumstances, but by the heart that beat within. Morning arrived with a brightness that seemed to mock Eleanor's exhaustion. She dressed carefully, choosing clothes that were clean and presentable without being pretentious. She wanted the focus to be on Hope and Faith, not on herself. At the facility, she found the twins calm and alert, having weathered their first night away from home with admirable composure. She groomed them until their coats gleamed, braiding their manes with ribbons that matched the chestnut patches on their white bodies. They looked beautiful, and more than that, they looked like the miracles they were. Hope stood tall and proud, her bold eyes surveying her surroundings with unshakable confidence. Faith stayed close to Eleanor, her gentle nature finding comfort in their bond, her trust evident in the way she responded to every touch and word. The hours before the presentation passed in a blur of nervous energy. Eleanor walked the twins around the facility, letting them acclimate to the sights and sounds of the showcase. She watched other presentations from the sidelines, studying the format and taking mental notes on what seemed to resonate with the audience. The horses on display were impressive, carefully bred animals from established bloodlines, their pedigrees reading like equine royalty. Eleanor felt the familiar twinge of doubt creeping back, the voice in her head whispering that she did not belong here, that her twins could not possibly compete with such aristocratic company. But then she looked at Hope and Faith, at the life that shone in their eyes and the spirit that animated their every movement, and she silenced that voice with the truth she held in her heart. These horses had already beaten odds that most people could not comprehend. They had already proven themselves in ways that no pedigree could match. The moment arrived with a crackle of the announcer's voice over the loudspeaker, calling Eleanor Mitchell and her twin foals to the main arena. She took a deep breath, gathered the lead ropes in her hands, and began the walk that would change everything. Hope and Faith moved beside her with a grace that seemed almost choreographed, their steps synchronized, their heads held high as they entered the arena. The crowd that filled the stands fell silent as they appeared, hundreds of eyes turning toward the unlikely trio making their way across the carefully groomed surface. Eleanor felt the weight of their attention like a physical force, pressing against her from all sides, but she did not falter. She had come too far to let stage fright defeat her now. Marcus Webb had arranged for the presentation to include visual elements, photographs projected on large screens that showed Grace at the auction, emaciated and broken, her ribs visible beneath her dull coat. The contrast with the beautiful foals now standing in the arena was immediate and striking. A murmur rippled through the crowd as people processed what they were seeing, the transformation that had taken place between those images and this moment. Eleanor began to speak, her voice amplified by a small microphone clipped to her collar, and as she told the story of Grace and her twins, the arena grew so quiet that she could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She told them about the auction, about the cruel words that had dismissed Grace as worthless. She told them about the $20 bid that had changed everything, about the discovery of the twin pregnancy, and the terrifying odds against survival. She described the night of the birth in detail, the cold and the darkness, and the desperate moments when Faith had lain motionless on the straw. Her voice cracked as she recounted how she had refused to give up, how she had worked to bring the tiny filly back from the edge of death. She spoke of Grace's devotion, the mare's tireless care for her daughters, despite her own weakened condition. She talked about the months that followed, the slow recovery, the growing bond between the three horses and the woman who had rescued them. And as she spoke, something remarkable began to happen in the crowd. People leaned forward in their seats, their expressions shifting from curiosity to engagement to genuine emotion. Some wiped tears from their eyes. Others nodded along as if they understood exactly what Eleanor had experienced, as if her story was somehow their story too. When Eleanor finished speaking, she asked Hope and Faith to demonstrate what they had learned. She put them through their paces, showing off the basic training they had mastered, their responsiveness to commands, their willingness to trust and cooperate. Hope performed with the showmanship that came naturally to her movements bold and eye-catching. Faith moved with a quieter grace, her sensitivity evident in the way she attuned herself to Eleanor's slightest cue. Together, they presented a picture of potential realized, of lives that had been saved and nurtured and given the chance to flourish. The audience watched in rapt attention, and when the demonstration concluded, the applause that erupted was unlike anything Eleanor had ever heard. It rolled through the arena like thunder, a wave of appreciation and respect that washed over her and the twins and seemed to validate everything she had done. The judges' evaluation came later that afternoon, but by then, the official assessment hardly mattered. Word of Eleanor's presentation had spread through the facility like wildfire, and people sought her out to shake her hand, to ask questions about Grace and the twins, to express their admiration for what she had accomplished. Breeders and trainers who had initially dismissed her as an amateur interloper now approached with genuine interest, wanting to know more about the horses that had captured everyone's attention. Several expressed interest in following the twins' development, offering resources and expertise that could help them reach their full potential. One woman, the owner of a therapeutic riding program for children with disabilities, was particularly taken with Faith. She recognized the gentle filly's special qualities and spoke at length with Eleanor about the possibility of future collaboration. By the time the showcase concluded, Eleanor had received more business cards and invitations than she could count. The twins had not won any official awards, their lack of documented pedigree disqualifying them from the formal competition categories, but they had won something far more valuable, the hearts of everyone who had witnessed their story. The narrative of Grace and her miracle foals had transcended the boundaries of the equestrian world, touching people on a level that had nothing to do with breeding or bloodlines. It was a story about second chances, about the power of love to transform what others had written off as worthless, about the courage to believe in possibilities when everyone else saw only problems. The drive home felt different from the journey out. Eleanor was exhausted in body, but exhilarated in spirit, her mind replaying the events of the showcase over and over. Hope and Faith traveled quietly in the trailer behind her, their calm demeanor suggesting they too were processing the experience they had just had. As the miles passed and familiar landmarks began to appear, Eleanor felt a profound sense of gratitude settling over her. She had taken a risk by accepting Marcus Webb's invitation, had stepped outside her comfort zone, and exposed herself and her horses to judgment and scrutiny. And it had paid off in ways she never could have anticipated. The showcase had opened doors that would shape the twins' futures. It had connected her with people who shared her passion and could support her mission. And it had proven, once and for all, that the value she had seen in Grace that day at the auction was real and recognized by others. When she finally pulled into the driveway of her farm, the setting sun casting long shadows across the pastures, Eleanor felt as if she was seeing her home with new eyes. Grace was waiting at the fence, exactly where she had been standing when Eleanor left, her patient vigil unbroken. As soon as the trailer came to a stop, the mare began to call out, her whinnies carrying across the evening air with an urgency that spoke of a mother's longing. Eleanor wasted no time unloading the twins, and the reunion that followed was a moment of pure and perfect joy. Grace nuzzled her daughters, breathing in their scent, reassuring herself that they were truly home and truly safe. Hope and Faith pressed against their mother, their young bodies seeking the comfort and security that only she could provide. The months that followed the showcase brought changes that Eleanor could never have predicted when she first raised her hand at that dusty auction. The story of Grace and her miracle twins continued to spread, carried by word of mouth and eventually by local news coverage that introduced the family to an even wider audience. People came from neighboring counties to visit the farm, drawn by a tale that resonated with something deep in the human spirit. They wanted to see the mare who had been dismissed as worthless, the twins who had defied every odds stacked against them, and the woman who had believed in them when no one else would. Eleanor welcomed them all, sharing her story with a generosity that came naturally to her. She understood that what had happened on her farm was not just her story. It belonged to everyone who had ever felt overlooked or undervalued, to everyone who had ever been told they were not worth the effort. Hope flourished in the spotlight that followed the showcase, her bold personality making her a natural ambassador for the farm and its mission. Marcus Webb kept his promise to support the twins' development, arranging for professional trainers to work with Hope on skills that would prepare her for a future in competitive riding. She took to the training with enthusiasm, her athletic ability and fearless temperament making her a standout even among horses with far more prestigious pedigrees. By the time she was 2 years old, she had already attracted attention from serious buyers who recognized her potential. But Eleanor was not interested in selling. Hope was not a commodity to be traded for profit. She was family, and family was not for sale at any price. Instead, Eleanor began exploring options for showcasing Hope's talents in ways that would honor her origins and the journey that had brought her into the world. Faith's path took a different direction, one that suited her gentle nature perfectly. The woman from the therapeutic riding program who had approached Eleanor at the showcase followed through on her interest, visiting the farm multiple times to observe Faith's temperament and evaluate her suitability for work with special needs children. What she found exceeded all expectations. Faith possessed an intuitive connection with humans that went beyond anything the woman had seen in her decades of work. The gentle filly could sense emotions with remarkable accuracy, responding to sadness with comfort and to fear with reassurance. She moved with a careful deliberation around those who were uncertain or anxious, adjusting her behavior to put them at ease. The decision to begin training Faith as a therapy horse was made with Eleanor's full blessing, though she insisted on remaining involved in every aspect of the process. Grace watched her daughters grow and change, with the quiet contentment of a mother who had given everything for her children and asked nothing in return. She had recovered fully from the twin pregnancy, her body filling out, and her coat regaining the shine that had been stripped away by neglect. She was no longer the broken creature that had stood alone in the auction ring, abandoned by those who should have cared for her. She was a queen among horses, respected and beloved by everyone who knew her story. Eleanor often found herself standing at the pasture fence in the early mornings, watching Grace graze in the golden light of dawn, marveling at the transformation that had taken place. The mare, who was not even worth $20, had become priceless, not because of what she could do or what she could produce, but simply because of who she was. As the years passed, the farm that had once been a quiet retreat for a grieving widow became something more, a sanctuary for horses in need, a place where animals that others had given up on could find a second chance. Eleanor established a nonprofit organization dedicated to rescuing and rehabilitating neglected horses, using the attention generated by Grace's story to raise funds and awareness. Volunteers came from across the region to help with the work, and the small herd that had once consisted of just a few aging geldings grew to include dozens of rescued animals at any given time. Each horse that came through the farm's gates received the same love and attention that Eleanor had lavished on Grace, and many went on to find forever homes with families who had been touched by the story of the miracle twins. Hope became a champion in the show ring, her natural abilities honed to perfection by years of dedicated training. She won ribbons and trophies that Eleanor displayed with pride, though she always made clear that Hope's greatest achievement was not her competitive success, but her survival. Faith became one of the most beloved therapy horses in the state, her gentle presence bringing comfort and healing to countless children and adults who struggled with the physical and emotional challenges. The sisters remained close, despite their different paths, their bond unbroken by time or distance. Whenever they were together, they moved in perfect synchrony, as if the connection forged in their mother's womb continued to guide them through life. Eleanor lived long enough to see her legacy take root and flourish, to watch as the seeds she had planted grew into something that would outlast her. She passed away peacefully on a spring morning, surrounded by the horses she loved, her final breath drawn in the barn where so many miracles had occurred. Grace, by then quite old herself, stood beside her at the end, as if keeping watch over the woman who had saved her life all those years ago. The community mourned Eleanor's passing, but they also celebrated her life and the profound impact she had made. The sanctuary continued under new leadership, her vision carried forward by those who had been inspired by her example. The story of Grace and her miracle twins became a legend, told and retold by those who had witnessed it and those who had only heard about it secondhand. It was a story about the power of love to transform what others had discarded, about the courage to see value where others saw only worthlessness, about the miracles that become possible when one person refuses to give up. And, at its heart, it was a story about a pregnant mare standing alone in an auction ring, dismissed by the world as not even worth $20, who gave birth to two beautiful foals and silenced everyone who had ever doubted her worth. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to to like and share it with others who might need to hear its message. Leave a comment below, telling us what you thought. And if you have not already, subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story like this one. Thank you for being here, and may you always remember that every life has value, even when the world fails to see it.